Okay, imagine waking up, seeing US Supreme Court slaps down Trump's tariffs, and for one sweet delusional second thinking, oh good, maybe this week we can all unclench. And then Trump shows up like, don't worry, I brought the golden hammer.
That's the story. Not the tariffs ended, not crisis over. The story is one weapon got taken away and the guy reached for the next one before the ink was dry.
And for Canada, that matters because most of the damage isn't coming from the weapon that the court just grabbed. It's coming from the ones still sitting on the table.
But today, the middle powers are finally hitting back. From Germany to Japan and right here in Canada, the plan to sideline the US is already in motion. Hope is not a strategy, and Canada just stopped hoping.
So let's start with the court ruling, because the headlines were, well, let's call them optimistic. The Supreme Court said Trump can't use IEEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Law, to impose broad tariffs the way he was doing, which is the legal version of you don't get to declare an emergency and then invoice the planet.
And this matters because Trump had been treating emergency like a magic word. Say it and suddenly you're allowed to do whatever you want. The court basically said, no way, man. That law doesn't do that.
But Trump didn't respond to the court with, oh, I respect the rule of law. Of course not. He responded with, fine, I'll do it in a different way.
So he started talking about Section 122 of the Trade Act. Temporary tariffs capped at 15% up to 150 days unless Congress extends.
Which is basically a tariff on a timer. It's not permanent, but it's long enough to do real damage, spook investors, and make supply chain people start drinking at lunch.
And then he bumps the talk from 10% to 15% because, of course he does. If you're going to light the room on fire, you don't do it with a birthday candle, you go full igniter.
And he expected everyone to just roll over. But the opposite happened. The rest of the world is starting to change the channel. Middle powers have quietly said, enough. They're tired of structuring their economies around one man's need for drama. They're not waiting for him to calm down. They're building around it.
Canada, Germany, the UK, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Brazil, the EU as a bloc, and what we're watching right now is these countries quietly deciding they're done waiting for the US to return to a predictable partner.
Just take a look at Europe. The EU had this trade arrangement floating around, and now EU lawmakers are openly saying, no, I think we might pause because the legal basis just shifted under our feet. Because the EU's posture is basically if the US can't commit to what it signs, we don't move forward like everything's normal.
And here's why that matters for Canada. Europe is demonstrating the correct response to chaos. You don't get hypnotized by the latest tariff number. You demand clarity. You build your own leverage. You stop acting like the US is the only door in the building.
The UK is another example. Starmer's government is openly saying retaliation is on the table while trying to avoid escalation. That's Britain doing what countries do when they're being jerked around. They prepare for the consequences.
And they already have a massive target list. Not because they want a trade war, but because you cannot negotiate if the other side thinks you'll never hit back.
And then you've got Brazil. Lula comes out and says Brazil doesn't want a new Cold War. We're not signing up for your global grudge match. Treat countries equally.
And we can't forget, for Canada, those temporary global tariffs don't really land the same way as they do for the rest of the world, because a lot of Canadian trade is still protected if it's CUSMA compliant. So the Supreme Court ruling changes the shape of the threat, but not the actual fact of the threat.
And that's why Doug Ford's reaction was so blunt. What keeps Ontario up at night is the sectoral tariffs that keep hitting the exact parts of our economy that are welded to the US auto, steel, aluminum, and lumber industries. Those are the pressure points. Ford basically said, don't kid yourself. This hasn't changed what matters for Ontario. We're still exposed. Section 232 is still sitting there like a loaded weapon pointed at autos, steel, and the rest of the supply chain.
And then he tells you how seriously he's taking it. It's all hands on deck. He's talking to other premiers, telling them to get on the phone, get on a plane, go talk to senators, members of Congress, governors, anyone.
And that's the part that Canadians never hear in the headlines. While Ottawa is stuck trying to deal with Washington at the top level, The provinces are quietly running their own ground game in the states. They're not waiting for a press conference. They're working the phones and trying to get people to change their minds.
And Ford dropped a really interesting detail. He says that the U.S. administration told him more than once that governors have a loud voice. That's the map right there. If Trump won't listen to Canada, maybe he'll listen to governors who are staring at lost factories, lost jobs, and angry voters.
And then Ford gives you the real diagnosis of the Trump problem, right? Not ideology, not left versus right, unpredictability. He literally says that things can change day to day, that Trump can wake up and either do a deal or blow up the CUSMA deal.
He says it's not enough to sit back and cross our fingers. We need plans for everything.
For once, I actually agree with him. Hope is what you use when your plane is landing. Strategy is what you use when your neighbor keeps threatening to rip up the runway.
And then he pivots to what he thinks that strategy looks like. Build out nuclear, cut approvals that take 18 years, move faster on parts of the economy that we can actually control. You can agree or disagree with his priorities, but at least he's talking like a premier who expects more shocks and wants Ontario to be less fragile when they land.
He also fires a warning shot at Ottawa. He repeats that line, no deal is better than a bad deal. And he name-checks Japan and the UK for rushing into agreements with Trump and then watching him turn on them like a rattlesnake. Because if it's built on Trump's goodwill, it's not a deal, it's a trap.
Then comes the part that everybody captured. The walls are closing in on President Trump. He points at the congressional vote where Republicans crossed the floor. He points at the Supreme Court decision, and he's basically saying, look, even inside the U.S. system, people are starting to push back.
But he doesn't even stop there. He spells out why this actually matters for Americans as well. He says prices are going up because of tariffs. That inflation down there is being driven by this nonsense, and he repeats the line that we've all been using for a year now. A tariff on Canada is a tax on the U.S. citizens.
And that's the message he plans to hammer in every American room he walks into. Not, please be nice to us. Not, remember, we're allies. It's cold math. If you hit Canada, your own voters pay the bill.
And then there's a line that tells you exactly what all of us has been asking. He says he sometimes sits back and wonders how one person, one man, can create so much turmoil around the world. Not just in Canada, everywhere. That's the Premier of Ontario looking at the global system and basically saying, this is nuts.
It is. And his closing note is pure exhaustion and calculation at the same time. I can't wait for the midterms. And I have to admit, neither can I. I just hope Trump actually allows midterms and doesn't decide the best way to hang on is to manufacture some crisis. Because at this point, I wouldn't put anything past him.
And that's the problem. It's not just that he's aggressive on tariffs, it's that he's unpredictable on purpose. And that unpredictability is the brand. It keeps him in the headlines, it keeps everyone off balance, and it keeps the focus on whatever rage post he had this morning instead of what's actually happening in the back rooms.
Yeah, while everyone is arguing about the latest tariff number, nobody is talking about who's cashing in on that chaos, what's buried in the fine print, or why certain names in the Epstein files never seem to make the light of day.
You see, chaos is cover. If you never know what tomorrow looks like, you can't build a coalition, you can't plan investment, and you sure can't hold anyone accountable for the deals that they cut yesterday.
Now let's bring it home. What does middle powers are done waiting look like in Canadian policy? Well, it looks like Canada building relationships that reduce our exposure to a single market. It looks like Canada securing deals in Europe that aren't just symbolic, but structural.
Look at what we've done over the last year. We signed on to SAFE with the EU, which means our defense industry is now tied into a European framework instead of waiting for scraps out of Washington. That's contracts, standards, long-term work.
And then there's critical minerals. Brussels needs reliable partners for EVs, batteries, aerospace, defense. Canada needs reliable buyers who aren't dangling tariffs over our head every time they need a distraction.
So when Canada lines up deals with the EU on critical minerals, we're not doing anyone a favor. We're locking in a future where our mines and processing plants aren't one angry post away from a crisis.
And listen, We need to walk away from the F-35 mess and go with the Gripens. That's a signal. Instead of doubling down on the American platform that keeps getting more expensive and more political, we should have a system tied into European supply chains and the European doctrine. The world is figuring out that basing your national future on Trump's mood is a really bad deal.
And I know we keep hammering this home, but that's the part that Canadian viewers really feel in their gut. If Trump decides he's mad at Ottawa, do we trust him not to pull the lever that suddenly makes maintenance or data access complicated? We've already seen what he's willing to do to factories and farms. You think jets are magically off limits? No way.
And that's why the Gripen pitch lands differently now. It's not just about price, it's about sovereignty. A Canadian production center, Canadian hands building Canadian aircraft again. Actual control over mission data instead of asking Washington for permission to use their software.
And you can feel the ghost of the Avro arrow in that argument. Canada once built one of the most advanced interceptors on Earth and then scrapped it. That scar, it never healed. Every time we sign another giant check to a US contractor, that wound gets poked. So we cannot make the same mistake twice.
So when people talk about a mixed fleet, they're really talking about hedging. Some F-35s because NORAD and interoperability still matter. A second line that doesn't live or die on whether the US president feels like being reasonable that week, well, that's the Gripen.
And sure, it's messy, it's expensive, but in a world where Trump threatens to throw a 25% tariff on Canadian airframe parts one day and hints at grabbing territory the next, one platform, one supplier, one country stops looking like efficiency and starts looking like a hostage situation.
The same tension shows up under the water. We don't have a shiny new submarine fleet. We have one operational boat and 3 either tied up or torn apart. And a bidding war on paper between Germany and South Korea is waiting to replace them.
Both sides are dangling jobs and investment. TKMS talks about maintenance hubs on both coasts. Maybe some builds here, maybe rare earths, mining, AI, batteries. Hanwha flashes partnership deals with Canadian Steel and promises to stand up a mill that can handle the alloys that those boats need.
And then you've got Melanie Joly saying, if you want that submarine deal, you come here with a car plant. Ottawa is very openly tying defense procurement to the auto sector and to critical minerals because Trump's tariffs hit those the hardest.
It's classic middle power energy, right? If we're going to spend $20+ billion on boats, we're not just buying hulls. We're buying leverage. We're buying jobs in Sault Ste. Marie. We're buying a stake in the next generation of batteries and EVs. We're telling Berlin and Seoul, if you want the contract, you help us stand up an economy that doesn't beg Washington for mercy every 6 months.
And let's be honest, Canada is good at announcements. We're not always great with follow-through, and we're all hedging that Carney's leadership will be different this time.
But even with all the salesmanship and numbers, the direction itself is real. Submarines, fighters, mining deals, auto plants, they're all being used to do the same thing. Tie Canada more tightly to European and Asian supply chains so that when Trump tries to weaponize trade, we have more than one escape route.
And that's the heart of the middle power moment. We're not out of the F-35 program yet. We haven't picked a submarine yet. But for the first time in decades, the debate in Ottawa isn't just, what does Washington want us to buy? It's, how do we make sure no U.S. president can kneecap our entire defense posture or industrial base with a single outburst?
In a world where Trump treats the global economy like a personal pressure campaign, Canada can't be held together by hope and old habits.
Jets, subs, minerals, car plants, none of it is settled, but the fact that we're finally using those decisions to claw back a little sovereignty, that's the part that says middle powers really are done waiting, and this is going to be an exciting year for Canada.
So, the real story this week isn't what Trump did, it's how the rest of the world reacted. Middle powers building paths that go around Washington instead of only going through it.
At this point, Canada's smartest move is to lean into that. Keep CUSMA where it protects us, but stop treating it like it's a magic shield. Use defense deals, critical minerals, and trade with other partners to spread the risk out instead of stacking it all on one border crossing.
Because we cannot spend the next decade living like this. refreshing the headlines 4 times a day to see if the toll to enter our own largest market just went up again.
And Carney's middle power speech in Davos said it all. The whole world is following his lead. Because once you stop acting like a junior partner and start acting like a country with options, the whole balance shifts.
Yep, and you feel it already. Canada led the way, and the world is listening. Listen, signatures aren't the hard part here. The hard part is whether the money actually moves, whether factories get built, whether mines and mills actually get orders. That's the difference between Canada playing along and Canada protecting itself.
So let us know in the comments, which part of our economy do you think needs that insulation first and why? Autos, steel, lumber, minerals?
And remember, like, subscribe, do all the things that tell the algorithm Canadians are paying attention, because we need more people awake for all of this.
Middle powers are done waiting for Trump.
And Canada, we're leading the way.
See you tomorrow, everyone.
Thanks for watching. Ciao for now.